It started with one of those half-serious, half-nervous laughs over dinner. Maybe we should try something different, my husband said, his fork tapping the edge of his plate. I remember the sound more than the words. The tap, 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 like a clock starting to count down to something I couldn't name yet. The house was quiet, too quiet for that kind of conversation. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but he didn't look up. He just kept his eyes on his food, like he'd already said too much. Different how? I asked. He shrugged, finally looking up. His eyes were calm in that way that made me uneasy, calm like he'd been thinking about this for a while. You'll see, he said. And that was it. Just like that, he changed the subject to work, the neighbor's new car, the weekend plans. But the air had shifted. I could feel in my hands. They wouldn't stop fidgeting. For context, I'm 46, married for 21 years. Stable, comfortable, maybe too comfortable. Our marriage wasn't broken. Not exactly, but lately it had started to feel like living in a house with all the lights turned off. Everything's still there, just dimmer. I thought maybe that's what he meant. Something wild, to shake us loose from routine. A trip, a surprise. Something harmless. I didn't know it would involve someone else. It was 2 days later when I met him, the someone. He came to fix the outdoor lights, of all things. So my husband had called him, that he'd been hired for a few home projects. He was younger, maybe late 20s, and had this polite, easy smile that lingered too long. Mrs. Turner, right? He asked, setting his toolbox down. Just Claire, I said automatically. He nodded. All right, Claire. Something about the way he said my name made it sound unfamiliar, like a word I hadn't heard in years. We talked a little while he worked. Nothing important. Weather, the noise from the road, how old the wiring was. But when he left, I realized I'd been holding my breath. And when my husband came home that night, he looked at me differently, almost like he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. The next morning, I found a note on the counter. It wasn't long, just a few words written in his familiar, tidy handwriting. He'll be back tomorrow. Be kind. At first, I thought it was a joke, but then I looked at the note again, the way the ink pressed hard into the paper. It didn't feel like a joke. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure I understood the man I'd married. Claire stands in the kitchen, holding the note, sunlight cutting across her wrist. The clock ticks. Outside, a car door shuts, and she freezes. The car door shut again. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang. Claire didn't move right away. The note was still in her hand, folded twice now, the crease deep like it had been read more than once already. She placed it on the counter carefully, as if setting down something fragile, and walked to the door. When she opened it, the same young man from before stood there, the one with the polite smile. Morning, he said, lifting a small bag of tools. Your husband said I should come by to check the backlights. There it was again, your husband said. She forced a smile, stepping aside. Right. Cool mean. The house wasn't fancy, but it had a kind of lived-in warmth. Shelves of old books, framed photos, the faint smell of coffee always in the air. 21 years of marriage, you collect things that way. Not just objects, but small routines that hold the walls up. Her husband, David, worked in real estate. Always busy, always composed. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice, but somehow made every room quiet when he walked in. They'd met when she was 25, when everything still felt open and new. He used to surprise her, not with gifts, but with attention. The way he'd listen when she talked about her art classes or the garden she wanted to start. Lately, though, that attention had gone somewhere else. Not to another woman. She was sure of that, but maybe to some version of himself he missed. Maybe that's what something wild meant. A spark, a risk, something to make him feel alive again. The young man, his name was Eli, she learned, worked quietly in the backyard. Through the window, she watched him kneel beside the wiring box, sleeves rolled up, concentration soft but steady. She caught herself staring too long and turned away quickly, pretending to busy herself with the dishes. When the door opened again, she flinched. Didn't mean to startle you, he said. Just checking the switches inside. He was close now, closer than before. The air seemed to narrow between them. She could smell the faint scent of rain on his jacket. You've done this kind of work long? She asked, her voice lower than intended. Yeah, he said, smiling faintly. but usually people don't watch me through the window. The words hung there, light, teasing, but heavier underneath. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came. He didn't look away. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it briefly and said, "Guess that's your husband. He wants me to finish by tomorrow." Claire blinked. "He called you?" Eli nodded, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Yeah, said he's got plans for the weekend." Plans she didn't know about. That night, when she asked David about it, he just smiled, a calm, unreadable smile. "You'll understand soon enough," he said. And the way he said it made her stomach twist. Claire didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed beside David, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun, slow and uneven. His breathing was steady, almost too calm, the kind of peace that made her wonder what he was thinking about. Every few minutes, she looked toward him, half expecting him to open his eyes and explain everything. But he never did. In the dark, her mind replayed his words. "You'll understand soon enough." The next morning, David left early. No note this time, just a faint smell of his cologne drifting from the hallway. Claire sat at the table with her coffee, watching the clock. When a knock finally came, it was exactly 9 a.m. morning again, Eli said, lifting the same bag of tools. There was something different about him today, not in his tone, but in how he looked at her, like he knew she'd been waiting. "You can start in the den today," she said. "The wiring there's old too." "Sure thing." He moved through the house with quiet confidence, leaving faint traces of sawdust and rainwater in his wake. Claire tried to stay busy, folding laundry, watering plants, but she found herself listening for his footsteps, noticing every small sound. At one point, she passed by the den and saw him studying an old painting on the wall. "That's one of yours?" he asked. She hesitated. "You can tell." He smiled. "It looks like something you'd want to hide, but couldn't." Her breath caught. It wasn't meant as anything deep, but it landed that way. No one had said something like that to her in years. By afternoon, David called. His voice was light. "How's it going?" "Fine," she said. "He's almost done." There was a pause, just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Good," he said. "Let him take his time." "Why? What is this really about, David?" But he only chuckled softly. "Trust me. You'll see." And then he hung up. That night, the silence in the house felt different, charged. Claire stood at the kitchen window, staring into the backyard. Eli's truck was still parked near the fence. He was inside it, talking on the phone. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but when he looked toward the house, their eyes met through the glass. He didn't look away right away, just long enough for her heart to misstep. She stepped back from the window, her pulse uneven. Why did it feel like she was the one being tested? By the third day, the house no longer felt like hers. Eli moved through it easily now, his toolbox on the counter, cords coiled near the doorway, his jacket hanging by the back door, as if it belonged there. David had been gone since morning, another meeting, another vague explanation. Claire tried not to think about it, but every quiet moment pressed against her like a question she couldn't answer. "Do you ever get tired of being alone in other people's houses?" she asked suddenly, as Eli checked the living room outlet. He looked up, surprised by the question. "Sometimes, but usually people talk to fill the silence." "Is that bad?" He smiled faintly. "Depend what they say." There was a pause, too long to be casual. He looked back down at the outlet, the hum of his drill filling the room. Claire folded her arms, not sure why her throat felt tight. That afternoon, she found another note from David. This one's shorter. "Don't back out. It's good for us. No explanation. No signature. Just those words." She stared at it for a long time, her reflection faint in the glass of the framed photo beside it, their wedding picture. David's hand around her waist, her younger face half turned toward him, smiling at something she couldn't even remember now. What was he doing? What was this? When Eli came in to grab some water, she couldn't hold it anymore. "Did my husband tell you what this is about?" she asked quietly. He froze mid-step. "He said you knew." Her voice lowered. "I don't." He nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers, uncertain, cautious. "He just said you wanted to feel different again, that I should help however I could." Claire's breath hitched. He said that. Eli's silence was answer enough. She turned away, gripping the counter, her thoughts racing. The hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud. Every sound in the house exaggerated. "What does that even mean?" she whispered. "I think he's trying to fix something," Eli said softly. "Or maybe break it first." The words landed heavier than either of them expected. Neither spoke for a while. The distance between them felt thinner. Not physical, but emotional, something fragile that neither could name. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, David's car pulled into the driveway. Claire stood near the window, hands pressed to the glass, heart pounding. Eli looked up from his work, following her gaze. David stepped out of the car, looked toward the house, and smiled. But there was something in that smile that didn't look like love anymore. David's smile lingered longer than it should have. The same smile he used when negotiating a deal, steady, polite, impossible to read. He walked in with his briefcase, still in hand, setting it by the stairs. "Looks like you two have been busy," he said, glancing toward the open wiring panel, then toward Eli. Eli straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Almost done. Just need to check the circuit box again." "Good," David said, nodding. "I like things finished properly." His tone was normal. Too normal. But Claire felt her pulse quicken anyway. Dinner was quiet. David had insisted Eli stay, said it was only fair since he'd been working late. The three of them sat at the table under the low kitchen light, the air filled with the smell of rosemary and something burning slightly in the oven. Claire kept her hands clasped in her lap. Eli looked uncomfortable, glancing between them. "So," David said finally, breaking the silence. "How's the house treating you, Eli?" "It's good," Eli replied cautiously. "Old wiring, but solid foundation." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I always liked about this place. Things can look worn out, but underneath, still strong." He looked at Claire when he said that. The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made her chest tighten. After dinner, David stood and began clearing the plates. Claire tried to help, but he shook his head. "I've got it," he said, voice too calm. Eli lingered awkwardly by the door, unsure whether to leave. Then David turned to him. "I need a favor. One last thing." "Eli hesitated." "Of course." David gestured toward the living room. "Wait there. I'll get something from the study." He disappeared down the hallway. The sound of a drawer opening echoed faintly. Claire turned to Eli, whispering, "You don't have to stay. I don't know what he's doing." Before he could respond, David returned, holding a small box. Not large, just enough to fit in one hand. He set on the table between them. "Open it," he said to Claire. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside was a small, silver key. "What is this?" she asked. David smiled again, that same unreadable smile. "It's the key to the cabin." "Eli Coronet." "Cabin." David looked between them. "Our family cabin. I booked it for the weekend. The two of you are going." The room went silent. Claire's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" "You said you wanted something wild," David said, his voice calm but eyes sharp. "So here it is. No phones. No pretending. Just honesty." Eli looked stunned. "Mr. Turner, I don't." David cut him off. "She needs to remember who she is, and you're going to help her." Claire rose to her feet, her voice shaking. "David, this isn't." But he didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her, the faintest trace of sadness crossing his face. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "people don't change until you give them no way back." Eli stood frozen, the key still glinting on the table between them. Claire couldn't tell whether her husband was trying to fix their marriage or end it. The key sat on the table like a dare. No one spoke for a long time, not even David. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house, steady and cold. Claire stared at the key, then at her husband. "You think this fixes something?" David's expression didn't shift. "I think it shows the truth." "What truth?" she said, her voice breaking slightly. "That you don't trust me? That you want me to—" He interrupted softly. "I want you to feel again, Claire." The words landed hard. It wasn't anger in his tone. It was something quieter, heavier. A confession disguised as control. Eli took a small step back. "Maybe I should leave," he murmured, but neither of them moved to stop him. "No," David said finally. "You're part of this now." They drove to the cabin that evening. Not because Claire agreed, but because silence had become easier than fighting. The road was narrow and dark, the headlights cutting through fog like blades. No one spoke. When they arrived, the air smelled of pine and rain. The cabin sat by the lake, still and distant, just as it had years ago, back when she and David used to come here in better days. Inside, the firewood was stacked neatly, the table set for three. Claire didn't ask how or why. She just stood there, listening to the sound of water lapping against the dock outside. David poured himself a drink, then one for her. "You remember this place?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "It used to feel like home." He looked toward Eli. "You can go outside if you want," he said. "We'll talk." Eli hesitated, then stepped out, closing the door behind him. The fire cracked softly. Claire turned to David. "What are you really doing?" He exhaled, the calm finally breaking. "I thought maybe if you saw someone else look at you the way I used to, you'd remember what we had." Her heart twisted. "You set this up?" His eyes were wet now, though he tried to hide it. "You've been gone for years, Claire. Not physically, just gone." The silence that followed felt endless. Then, softly, she said, "And you thought you could bring me back with this?" He nodded once. "I had to try." The door creaked open. Eli stood there, uncertain, holding his phone. "David, your car alarm's going off." David blinked. "What?" Eli stepped aside, and through the doorway they saw it. Headlights flashing, horn blaring, echoing through the trees. David walked outside toward it, frustration tightening his shoulders. Claire watched him go, the firelight flickering against the walls. Eli looked at her. "Should I?" She shook her head. No, the horn stopped suddenly. And then came the silence, deep, unfamiliar, final. The woods went quiet again. Only the lake moved, rippling softly under the fading light. Claire stood at the door, waiting for David to come back inside, but he didn't. A minute passed. Then two. Eli took a cautious step forward. "Should we check on him?" She nodded. Together they walked out into the damp night. The car sat still now, headlights off, doors closed. The alarm was silent, but David wasn't there. "David," Claire called softly. No answer. They found him a few yards away, sitting on the edge of the dock. He wasn't hurt, just sitting there, his shoes half in the water, the sound of the lake brushing against the wood. "I turned it off," he said, voice quiet. "Faulty sensor." "Figures." Claire stood beside him. For the first time in days, he looked smaller, like the weight he'd been carrying finally showed. "I didn't want to scare you," he said after a long silence. "I just didn't know how else to reach you." She sat down next to him, her knees brushing the wet wood. "You could have just told me you missed me." He gave a short, broken laugh. "You wouldn't have believed me." The honesty in that stung. Maybe he was right. Eli lingered a few steps back, unsure whether to leave or stay. Claire turned slightly toward him. "You can go," she said gently. "Thank you for helping." He nodded slowly, his eyes soft. "Take care of each other," he said, before heading back toward the cabin. When it was just the two of them, the quiet settled differently, not sharp anymore, but fragile. David rubbed his palms together, eyes fixed on the water. "I thought maybe if I push you far enough, you'd feel something again. Anger, sadness, anything." Claire exhaled. "You don't have to break something to prove it's still alive." He looked up at her then, really looked, and she could see the exhaustion behind his calm. "I didn't want to lose you." "You didn't," she said softly. "You just forgot how to find me." They sat there until the stars came out, neither speaking, the air filled only with the sound of the lake and the low hum of crickets. The wildness he'd wanted, it had come, just not the way either of them expected. Finally, Claire reached out, her hand resting over his. He didn't pull away. Maybe that was enough for now. Weeks later, back home, the note he'd left still sat folded in the drawer. "Be kind." She kept it there, not as a reminder of what almost broke them, but of how fragile people become when they stop trying to be seen.